Cowboy, please, don't turn away. Her voice carried across the still water, thin but steady, the kind of voice that had already decided to be heard or to break trying. And Ethan Cole stopped mid-step at the edge of the lake, boots sinking half an inch into damp earth, the smell of wet clay and sunburned grass rising around him, his shadow stretching long over the surface where she stood waist-deep, arms folded close, not out of shame, but out of something older, something learned, and he didn't look at her, not yet, because the air behind him had shifted in a way the wind alone could not explain, a quiet pressure, like a held breath, like eyes that did not blink. They took everything, she said again, softer now, and the ripples around her slowed as if the lake itself was listening, and Ethan's jaw tightened just enough to show he understood more than the words themselves, because no one took everything without reason out here, not unless they planned for what came next. He let his gaze drift past her shoulder, to the far bank where reeds bent slightly in a direction the breeze did not follow, and there, faint but clear, were the marks, 3 sets of tracks pressed into the mud, horse hooves, fresh, less than an hour old, circling, waiting, not leaving. Ethan exhaled through his nose, slow, controlled, the kind of breath a man takes when he's counting the distance between choices, and he removed his hat just enough to wipe the sweat line from his brow before setting it back in place, his movements calm, deliberate, as if nothing at all was wrong. "Don't come closer," she said suddenly, her voice tightening, not in fear of him, but in warning, and that made him pause more than anything else, because fear he understood, but warning meant she knew something he didn't. He finally spoke, low, even, wasn't planning to, and still, he didn't look directly at her, instead reaching back to unbutton his coat, the worn leather creaking softly as he slipped it off and tossed it toward a flat stone near the water's edge, turning his head just enough to give her space without giving up awareness of everything else, because out here, respect was not softness, it was survival. The coat landed with a dull thud, and for a second, nothing moved, not the water, not the wind, not even the distant call of a hawk overhead. And then she stepped forward just enough to reach it, the surface breaking around her in quiet circles, her hand emerging to pull the fabric close, quick, efficient, no hesitation, like someone used to taking what little safety was offered and never asking for more. Ethan's eyes flicked once, just once, enough to confirm she had it, then shifted, back to the tree line behind her, where shadows held a fraction too still, where silence pressed in too tight. "You should leave," she said, voice lower now, almost lost in the open space, and Ethan gave the smallest shake of his head, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. "Too late for that," he replied, and this time, he turned, slow, measured, just enough to face the dry land behind him, where the tracks led, where the quiet waited, and where something unseen was already deciding what kind of man he was going to be. The tracks led away from the lake in a slow, deliberate arc, not hurried, not careless, but measured, like the men who made them had all the time in the world, and Ethan followed them with his eyes before taking a single step, his boots pressing into the damp soil with a quiet certainty that matched the rhythm of his breathing. Behind him, the faint sound of water shifting told him she had moved closer to the shore, but he did not turn again. Not yet, because whatever had been set in motion here was not finished, it was only waiting. "3 riders," he said, more to the land than to her, his voice low and steady. They circled back instead of leaving, and there was a pause before she answered, a pause long enough to carry meaning. "They always do," she replied, and something in the way she said it made the air feel heavier, like this was not the first time she had stood in a place like this. Ethan crouched slightly, brushing his fingers across the edge of a hoofprint, the impression still sharp, the edges not yet softened by wind or time, and he glanced toward the tree line where the shadows gathered thicker than they should at this hour, the sun still high enough to push light deep into the brush. Yet something held it back. "They want you to run," he said, straightening slowly, his eyes scanning the distance in careful sweeps. "That way they do not have to chase." And this time, when he spoke, he turned just enough to see her from the corner of his eye, standing now at the edge of the water with his coat wrapped securely around her shoulders, the fabric too large, hanging heavy, but held in place with a quiet dignity that did not belonged to someone defeated. She stepped onto the bank, bare feet pressing into the mud, leaving smaller prints beside the larger ones that had come before, and for a moment, the contrast said everything without words. But her posture remained straight, her chin lifted just enough to meet the horizon instead of the ground. "You should not stay," she said again. But the urgency in her voice had shifted, less fear now, more understanding. As if she already knew his answer before he gave it. Ethan gave a slight tilt of his head, almost a nod, but not quite. "You already said that," he replied, and there was the faintest trace of something dry in his tone, not humor, but something close enough to ease the edge of the moment. The wind shifted again, carrying a distant creak, leather against saddle, faint but unmistakable, and both of them heard it this time. Both of them turning their attention toward the same stretch of land where the trees thinned just enough to offer a path. "They are close," she said, her voice steady now, no longer trembling, and her hand moved instinctively to the cord at her neck, fingers tightening around the small object hidden beneath the coat. Ethan noticed, not the object itself, but the way she held it, like it carried more than weight, like it carried a decision. He adjusted his stance slightly, placing himself not in front of her, but beside her, a subtle shift that changed the space between them from distance into alignment. "If they wanted you gone," he said quietly, eyes fixed ahead, "they would not have taken your things, they would have taken something else." And he let the sentence settle without finishing it, because it did not need to be spoken aloud. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the kind of understanding that did not come from words. And then, just at the edge of hearing, came the soft, steady rhythm of hooves against dry ground, approaching without hurry, without fear, as if whatever was coming believed it already owned the outcome. Ethan did not reach for anything, did not step back, did not raise his voice. He simply stood, shoulders squared, eyes forward, waiting, because sometimes the line between leaving and staying was not drawn by distance, but by the moment a man chose to remain exactly where he was. The sound of hooves grew clearer, not fast, not rushed, but steady, like men who knew exactly what they would find when they arrived. And Ethan felt the weight of that certainty more than the sound itself. His eyes narrowing slightly as three riders emerged from the thinning trees, their silhouettes cutting through the light with quiet confidence. Horses slowing to a measured walk as they approached the edge of the clearing, and for a moment, no one spoke. Not Ethan, not the woman beside him, not even the riders, because silence, out here, often said more than words ever could. The lead rider tilted his head just enough to study the scene, his gaze moving from Ethan to the woman, then to the coat wrapped around her shoulders, and something faint, almost amused, touched the corner of his expression before fading just as quickly. "You found yourself in the wrong place," he said finally, his voice even, not raised, not threatening, but carrying the kind of calm that came from believing. He did not need to be either, and Ethan did not answer right away, his posture unchanged, his hands relaxed at his sides, not reaching, not preparing, just present. The second rider shifted slightly in the saddle, his eyes fixed on the cord at the woman's neck, and that was enough for Ethan to notice, enough to confirm what had not yet been spoken, and beside him, the woman drew a slow breath, steadying herself, her fingers tightening once more around the small object hidden beneath the fabric, as if reminding herself of something that could not be taken as long as she chose to. "Hold it. You took her things," Ethan said at last, his voice low, not accusing, not demanding, simply stating what was already clear, and the lead rider gave a small shrug, almost casual. "Things can be replaced," he replied, glancing again at the woman. "Some things are harder to come by." And the meaning settled into the space between them without needing to be explained. The wind passed through the clearing again, stirring dust and grass, and for a brief second, it carried something else. With it, something distant, something faint, but not yet strong enough to name. And Ethan's attention flickered toward the ridge before returning to the men in front of him. "You should step away," the lead rider continued, his tone unchanged, as if offering a simple suggestion rather than a command. "This does not concern you." And there it was again, that quiet certainty, that assumption that the outcome had already been decided. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, not backward, not forward, just enough to settle his stance beside the woman, aligning himself without making a show of it. And when he spoke, his words were simple, unadorned. "It concerns me now." And the air seemed to hold that sentence for a moment longer than it should have, stretching it, weighing it. The third rider let out a slow breath, almost a sigh, as if this was not how the exchange had been expected to go, and the horses beneath them shifted, sensing something in their riders that had not yet reached the surface. Beside Ethan, the woman straightened fully, no longer half-turned toward the water, no longer divided between leaving and staying, her presence solid now, grounded, and when she spoke, her voice carried further than before, clear and steady. "You will not take it," she said, and the words did not sound like a plea. They sounded like a line drawn across the earth. The lead rider's gaze sharpened slightly, the faint hint of amusement gone now, replaced by something more attentive, more calculating, and for the first time, the balance shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that it could be felt in the way the silence settled again, heavier than before. Ethan did not move, did not speak, did not look away. He simply stood, listening, not just to the men in front of him, but to the land beyond them, to the ridge, to the wind, to something that was beginning to gather just out of sight. Because sometimes the difference between being alone and not being alone was not distance, it was timing. And something about this moment told him that whatever came next was already on its way. The stillness stretched just a second too long, the kind of silence that made even the horses shift their weight, ears twitching towards something none of the men had yet acknowledged, and Ethan felt it again, that faint pull from beyond the ridge, like the land itself was leaning closer to listen. The lead rider studied him more carefully now, no longer dismissing him as a passerby, but measuring him, weighing something unseen, and when he spoke again, his tone carried less certainty, though he tried to hide it beneath the same calm surface. "You are standing in the middle of something you do not understand," he said, and Ethan's eyes did not leave him, steady, unblinking. "Then explain it," he replied, simple, direct, the words falling into the space between them without force, but without retreat. The second rider shifted again, impatience flickering across his face, his gaze returning to the cord at the woman's neck as if drawn by it. And this time, Ethan followed that line fully, his attention settling on the small shape beneath the fabric, noticing the way it caught light even when hidden, the way it seemed to carry weight beyond its size. Beside him, she lifted her chin a fraction higher, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. "It is not theirs," she said, and though the words were spoken softly, they carried a boundary that could not be mistaken. The third rider let out a slow breath through his nose, glancing toward the ridge, then back again, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something uncertain in his expression, something that had not been there when they arrived. The lead rider noticed it too, his jaw tightening just slightly before he spoke again, more deliberate this time. "That belongs to someone who is no longer here to claim it," he said, his eyes narrowing at the woman. "You are holding on to something that was never meant to be yours." And the air shifted again, not with wind, but with meaning, the kind that settled deep and refused to move. Ethan felt the tension in the woman beside him, not fear, but resistance, something rooted, something chosen, and when she answered, her voice did not rise, did not waver. It simply held. "You are wrong," she said, and the quiet certainty in those 3 words seemed to carry further than anything spoken before. The lead rider tilted his head slightly, studying her in a new way now, not as prey, not as an obstacle, but as something else entirely, something that required a different kind of approach. And he glanced once more toward the ridge, as if confirming something only he could see. Ethan followed that glance this time, his eyes narrowing just enough to catch it, a shift in the line of the horizon, a shape where there had been none before, then another, distant, barely visible, but unmistakable once seen, and though no sound had reached them yet, the presence was there, gathering, patient. The horses beneath the riders sensed it next, their heads lifting, nostrils flaring slightly as they caught something carried on the air that had not been there moments ago. And the second rider straightened in his saddle, his earlier confidence fading just a fraction as his eyes moved between Ethan, the woman, and the ridge beyond. "You should have walked," Away, he said, though this time, the words sounded less like a warning and more like a realization, and Ethan gave the slightest shake of his head, not dismissive, not defiant, just certain. You already know I would not, he replied, and the simplicity of it seemed to settle heavier than any argument. Beside him, the woman loosened her grip on the cord just enough to let it rest against her chest, no longer hidden, no longer guarded in the same way, as if the act of standing here had already changed something that could not be undone. The lead rider drew in a slow breath, his gaze moving once more to the ridge, then back to Ethan, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, not agreement, not understanding, but recognition, the kind that came when a line had been crossed and could not be stepped back from. The silence returned again, deeper now, thicker, filled with the sense that whatever came next would not be decided by the three men who had ridden in, but by something far older, far steadier, and already on its way down from the high ground. The ridge no longer looked empty, and once seen, it could not be unseen, shapes resolving from shadow into riders who did not rush, did not shout, did not announce themselves with anything louder than presence. And that quiet arrival carried farther than any noise could have, pressing down on the clearing like a slow, gathering storm. Ethan felt it in the way the air cooled against his skin, in the way the light seemed to flatten, in the way the three horses across from him shifted again, there. Riders sitting a little straighter without meaning to, as if something older than thought had reached them first. The lead rider's eyes moved back to the woman, then to the cord resting against her chest, and for a moment he said nothing, calculating, adjusting, the certainty he had arrived with now bending into something more careful. You have drawn attention, he said finally, but the words no longer sounded like a claim of control, more like a recognition of consequence, and the woman did not lower her gaze, did not step back. She simply answered. It was already here, her voice even, grounded, as if the truth did not belong to either side but to the land itself. Ethan kept his stance beside her, not in front, not behind, a choice that said more than any declaration could, and he let his eyes move once more to the ridge, where the line of riders had grown clearer now, numbers forming, not 1 or 5, but many, their silhouettes steady against the sky, no weapons raised, no movement wasted, only watching. The second rider drew in a breath that did not quite settle, his fingers tightening slightly on the reins before loosening again, and he glanced at the lead rider as if waiting for direction that had not yet come. The third rider shifted his weight, his earlier ease gone now, replaced by a quiet awareness that whatever had begun here was no longer contained. This does not change what is owed, the lead rider said, though his voice carried less weight than before, as if the words themselves had lost some of their ground, and Ethan tilted his head just slightly, considering, then answered without raising his tone, Then you should be certain what is owed, and to whom. And the simplicity of it landed between them with a kind of finality that made the air tighten again. Beside him, the woman's hand moved once more to the cord, but this time her grip softened, not releasing it, but no longer holding it as if it might be taken at any second. And when she spoke, her voice carried farther than before, steady, unwavering. It is not yours to claim, she said, and the words did not challenge, they defined. The wind shifted once more, and this time it carried something unmistakable, a low, distant call that rose and fell like a breath drawn across the hills, not loud, not sharp, but present, and the horses heard it before the men did, ears turning, bodies tensing in a way that could not be trained out of them. Ethan did not turn, did not move, but he felt the shift fully now, the line that had been forming finally crossing into something real, something visible, something that could no longer be ignored. The lead rider exhaled slowly, his gaze lifting once more to the ridge where the figures now stood clearly, not hidden, not uncertain, simply there, and for the first time since he had arrived, he did not speak immediately, as if weighing whether words still held the same value they had moments ago. The clearing held its breath again, thicker now, deeper, every sound muted beneath the presence gathering above, and Ethan remained exactly where he was, not because he believed he could change what was coming, but because he understood that leaving now would mean something different than it would have before. Beside him, The woman stood just as still, the coat settling around her shoulders, the cord resting against her chest, no longer hidden, no longer offered, simply held. And as the first rider on the ridge began to move forward, slow, deliberate, neither rushing nor hesitating, it became clear that whatever had been set in motion here was not about taking, not about chasing, but about something quieter, something heavier, something that would decide, without raising a voice, who truly understood what it meant to stand. The first rider from the ridge did not hurry, and that alone changed everything. Because men who rushed were uncertain, but men who moved like that carried something else, something that did not need to prove itself. He guided his horse down the slope with slow, deliberate steps, the animal sure-footed on the uneven ground, and behind him, the rest did not follow all at once. They waited, spaced across the horizon like markers set long before this moment began, and Ethan watched without turning, his head fully, his eyes tracking the descent through the corner of his vision, while keeping the three men in front of him within reach of his awareness. The lead rider in the clearing shifted again, not retreating, not advancing, but adjusting in a way that betrayed something he had not intended to show. And when he spoke, his voice carried a tighter edge. "You have made this more complicated than it needed to be," he said, though the words now sounded less like control and more like an attempt to hold on to it. Ethan did not answer immediately, his attention splitting between the man approaching from the ridge and the one speaking before him, measuring distance, timing, the space between decisions, and beside him, the woman stood unmoving, her posture steady, her gaze no longer fixed on the men across from them, but lifted slightly toward the rider descending from above. The wind eased, and with it came a clarity that had not been there before, the kind that sharpened outlines and stripped away doubt. And Ethan could see now the details that distance had hidden, the markings on the rider's clothing, the way he held himself, not rigid, not relaxed, but balanced, like someone who carried responsibility rather than force. "You still have time to step aside," the second rider in the clearing said, though his voice no longer held the same weight, the certainty thinning as the space filled with something he could not command. And Ethan gave a small breath, almost a sigh, not of frustration, but of acceptance. "You keep saying that," he replied quietly, "like it changes something." And the words settled with a calm that did not challenge, but did not yield. The rider from the ridge reached the lower ground now, his horse stepping onto the flatter earth with a soft thud that seemed louder than it should have been, not because of sound, but because of what it meant, and he did not look at Ethan first, nor at the three men who had arrived earlier. His gaze went directly to the woman, steady, searching, as if confirming something that mattered more than anything else present. She met that gaze without hesitation, her hand resting lightly against the cord at her chest, not gripping it, not hiding it, simply acknowledging it. And for a moment, no one spoke, not even the wind seemed to move, because whatever passed between them did not belong to language. The lead rider in the clearing drew a slow breath, his patience thinning, though he tried to hold it in place. "This concerns us," he said, his voice firmer now, as if reclaiming ground, and the man from the ridge turned his head just slightly, enough to acknowledge the words without giving them weight, his eyes moving over the three riders in a quiet assessment that lasted no more than a second but seemed to stretch far longer. Ethan felt the shift then, subtle but undeniable, the center of the moment moving, no longer held between him and the three men, but drawn toward this new presence, this quiet authority that had arrived without demand. Beside him, the woman took a single step forward, not toward the ridge rider, not away from Ethan, but into the space between all of them. And when she spoke, her voice carried a clarity that cut through everything that had come before. "It was never theirs," she said, and there was no force in it, no anger, just truth, laid down like a stone that could not be moved. The man from the ridge nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and in that small motion, something settled, something decided, though not yet spoken aloud, and Ethan remained where he was, shoulders steady, eyes forward, understanding that whatever came next would not be decided by strength, nor by numbers, but by something far quieter, something already taking shape in the silence between them. The man from the ridge did not raise his voice, did not reach for anything, did not even shift in his saddle beyond what was needed to face them all. And yet the weight of his presence settled across the clearing in a way that none of the others could ignore. Not Ethan, not the three riders, not even the horses that now stood quieter than before, their earlier restlessness replaced by a stillness that felt almost deliberate. His gaze moved once more to the woman, then to the cord resting openly against her chest. And there was something in his expression that softened, not weakness, not hesitation, but recognition, the kind that carried memory rather than judgment. "You kept it," he said at last, his voice low, steady, carrying just enough to reach every ear without needing to rise. And the woman answered without pause. "It was never mine to lose," her tone matching his, not defiant, not pleading, simply certain. And the space between those two sentences seemed to hold more truth than everything that had been said before. Ethan felt it then, the shift completing itself, the center of the moment no longer balanced between conflict, but settling into something clearer, something that did not need force to define it. The lead rider from the three straightened in his saddle, his earlier composure now stretched thin. "That belongs to our claim," he insisted, though the words lacked the ground they had once stood on. And the man from the ridge turned his eyes toward him fully now, not sharply, not aggressively, but with a calm that did not invite argument, only response. "Your claim was never recognized," he said, each word measured, leaving no room for misunderstanding. And the silence that followed carried a finality that no raised voice could have matched. The second rider shifted, glancing toward the ridge where the line of watchers remained, unmoving. And something in that sight seemed to settle the question he had not wanted to ask, his shoulders lowering just slightly, the tension easing not from relief, but from acceptance. Beside Ethan, the woman took another step forward, closing the space between herself and the man from the ridge, not crossing a line, but acknowledging one, and she reached up slowly, her fingers brushing the cord at her neck before letting it fall back against her chest, not offering it, not hiding it, simply allowing it to be seen. Ethan watched that movement carefully, not because of what it revealed, but because of what it did not. There was no fear in it now, no urgency, only a quiet confidence that had not been there when she stood in the water. "You were not followed," the man from the ridge said to her, and she shook her head once. "They found the trail, not me," she replied, and the meaning settled in the clearing with a clarity that shifted the last of the tension into place. The lead rider drew a slow breath, his eyes moving from the cord to the ridge and back again, calculating something that no longer held the same outcome. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, stripped of its earlier certainty. "Then this ends here," he said, though it sounded less like a decision and more like a conclusion he had no power to change. The man from the ridge gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and then his gaze moved once more to Ethan, studying him now with the same careful attention he had given the others, and for a moment, neither spoke. Because whatever passed between them did not belong to words, it belonged to the simple fact that one had chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier. The wind moved again, softer this time, carrying away the weight that had pressed down on the clearing, and one by one, the riders on the ridge began to turn their horses, not in retreat, not in triumph, but in quiet completion, as if the moment had been what mattered, not the outcome. Ethan remained where he was, his stance unchanged, his presence steady, understanding now that the line he had stepped into had never been about taking sides, but about standing long enough for the truth to show itself. And beside him, the woman exhaled slowly, the tension leaving her shoulders at last, not because she had been saved, but because she had not been forced to stand alone. The riders on the ridge began to drift apart, not in disorder, but in quiet purpose, each one turning their horse with the same measured control they had arrived with. And the clearing seemed to breathe again as the weight that had pressed down slowly lifted, though it did not disappear entirely. It lingered, like something important had passed through and left its mark behind. Ethan remained where he stood, boots still planted in the damp earth near the water's edge, his shoulders relaxed now, but not careless, his eyes following the movement on the ridge until the last silhouette faded into the distance. And only then did he allow his focus to return fully to the space around him. The three riders who had arrived first did not leave immediately. though the certainty that had once held them there was gone, replaced by something quieter, something that made them hesitate in a way they had not before. And the lead rider exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering from the ridge to the ground. Between them, as if measuring the distance he had misjudged, "This was not meant to unfold like this," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. And the admission carried no anger, only the dull weight of something realized too late. Ethan gave a slight tilt of his head, acknowledging the words without responding, because some things did not require an answer, only acceptance. Beside him, the woman stood still, the coat wrapped securely around her shoulders, the fabric settling naturally now. No longer clutched, no longer borrowed in desperation, but worn with a quiet composure that matched the way she held herself. Her hand rested lightly against the cord at her chest, not guarding it, not displaying it, simply allowing it to remain where it belonged. The man from the ridge lingered a moment longer than the others, his horse still, his posture unchanged, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer than before, though no less clear. "The path ahead is yours to choose," he said to her, and there was no instruction in it, no expectation, only recognition, as if whatever she decided would stand on its own without needing approval. She met his gaze steadily, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them once more, something rooted in history, in memory, in a shared understanding that did not need to be explained. Then she gave a single nod, small but certain, and that was enough. The man from the ridge inclined his head in return, a gesture of respect rather than authority, before guiding his horse to turn, joining the others as they disappeared beyond the rise, leaving the clearing quieter than it had been before any of them arrived. The three riders remained a moment longer, their presence now out of place in a way that could not be ignored, and the second rider shifted in his saddle, glancing once more at the cord, then at Ethan, as if searching for something that was no longer there. "You stood your ground," he said finally, his voice lacking the edge it once held, and Ethan's response was simple, almost absent. "I stayed," he said, and the distinction between the two seemed to settle deeper than either man expected. The lead rider gave a slow nod, accepting something he had not planned to, and with a final glance toward the woman, he turned his horse, the others following without another word, their departure quieter than their arrival, as if the land itself had taken something from them that could not be reclaimed. The clearing grew still again, truly still this time, the wind returning to its natural rhythm, the water at the lake's edge lapping softly against the shore. And Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he had been holding. Beside him, the woman shifted slightly, the tension finally leaving her shoulders, and for the first time since he had heard her voice, the space between them felt open, not divided by uncertainty, not held by necessity, but simply shared. She looked out across the water for a moment, then back toward the ridge, now empty, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet, but steady. "You did not have to stay," she said, and Ethan's gaze followed hers briefly before returning to the ground ahead. "No," he replied, just as quietly, "but I did." And the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything else that had been said, leaving the moment suspended, not finished, not closed, but ready for whatever would come next. The lake returned to its quiet rhythm, as if nothing had happened, as if the air had not just carried the weight of decisions that could have gone another way. And Ethan stood there for a moment longer, letting the stillness settle into his bones, the kind of stillness that only comes after something has passed without breaking. The sun had begun its slow descent, lowering toward the horizon, casting longer shadows across the water, and the reflection of the sky stretched thin across the surface, turning gold, then amber, then something softer. Beside him, the woman adjusted the coat slightly around her shoulders, not hurried, not uncertain, but with a calm that had not been there before, and when she stepped forward, it was not to leave, not yet, but simply to stand on dry ground without looking over her shoulder. Ethan glanced once toward the ridge, now empty, then back to the shoreline, where the marks of hooves still pressed into the earth, reminders of something that had nearly taken shape but had been turned aside, not by force, but by something quieter. "They will not come back," she said, her voice steady, almost certain, and Ethan nodded slightly, not because he knew, but because he understood the difference between men who leave by choice and those who are forced to, and this had been the first kind. The wind moved gently across the water, lifting a few strands of her dark hair, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence no longer demanded to be filled. She looked down at the cord resting against her chest, her fingers brushing it lightly, and then she turned toward him, her gaze steady, searching, not for answers, but for something else, something harder to name. "You did not ask what it was," she said, and Ethan shifted his weight slightly, his boots pressing into the dirt with a soft sound. "Did not need to," he replied, his tone even, without curiosity, without distance, just acceptance. She studied him for a moment longer, as if weighing that answer, and then she gave a small nod, not of agreement, but of understanding, as if she had expected something different and found something else entirely. The light continued to fade, stretching the moment thinner, quieter, and she stepped closer to the edge of the water once more, her reflection meeting her gaze for a brief second before she looked away again. "Where I come from," she said slowly, choosing her words with care. "Standing beside someone, it means something." And the sentence lingered there, unfinished, not because it lacked an ending, but because it did not need one. Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes following the horizon where the last of the light held on. "Out here," he said, just as quietly. "It usually does." And there was no claim in it, no expectation, just a simple truth laid down between them. She reached up then, loosening the cord slightly, her fingers brushing the small object it held, and for a moment, it looked as though she might remove it, offer it, explain it. But instead, she let it rest where it was, her hand falling back to her side. The decision made without words. The space between them remained unchanged, not closer, not further, simply shared. And the lake, the land, the fading light all seemed to hold that space with them, not pushing, not pulling, just allowing it to be. She turned her gaze toward the open plains beyond the trees, where the path stretched out into distance, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, but no less certain. "Then maybe this is not where it ends," she said, and Ethan followed her gaze, the horizon wide, empty, full of possibility and consequence alike. And he gave the smallest nod, not as an answer, not as a promise, but as acknowledgement. The wind carried the last warmth of the day across the clearing, and for a moment, everything stood balanced between what had been and what might come next,